It was a splendid morning on the island of Sodor. James was feeling very pleased with himself. His red paint gleamed in the sunshine as he sped along the line. He reached the junction just as Percy puffed in with some freight cars. James was surprised to see him.
What are you doing here, Percy? You should be at the station by now.
I know, sighed Percy. These cars have been troublesome all morning.
That's no excuse, Percy. Nothing should stop us. Sir Topham Hatt relies on us to be on time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be on my way.
And James puffed importantly away. Bossy buffers, muttered Percy. James arrived at the harbor. It was market day. The harbor yard was filled with the sweet smell of fruit from faraway lands. The fruit was delivered in big ships. James watched as strawberries, oranges, melons, and bananas were carefully loaded onto his cars. Then he set off for the station on the main line. On the way, he met Thomas.
Really reliable, that's me,
panted James.
Pity the same can't be said for Percy. Goodbye.
What was all that about? Gasped Annie and Clarabelle. That was trouble. Trouble for James. Just wait and see. Percy was back in the yard and busy shunting. He had the cars in good order and was making up for lost time. But the station master had bad news.
What's happened?
Asked Percy's driver.
James's brakes have jammed. We need Percy's help right away.
Percy quickly set off to the rescue. James was stuck on the line and looking glum. Percy couldn't help laughing.
Got yourself in a bit of a jam, eh, James? A sticky situation? Be quiet. It's not funny having jammed brakes.
And not very reliable either. I'm surprised you let it happen, James. Nothing should stop us engines.
That's enough, Percy, said the driver. Can you push these cars?
Of course I can. There's no time to lose. James has done too much of that already. James angrily hissed steam as Percy was coupled to the cars. Off we go, said Percy. I'll have to go fast to get there in time. Those big engines are so unreliable.
Be careful, Percy,
called his driver, but Percy was in a hurry. He didn't see that the switch had failed and that he had been diverted into a siding.
Look out, Percy,
shouted his driver and applied the brakes, but it was too late. The driver and fireman had jumped clear, but squashed fruit squirted all over Percy. Sir Topham Hatt arrived.
Percy, you are not to blame for the switch failure, but I do not run a jam factory.
Yes, sir. No, sir. And Percy squelched sadly away. That night, the shed was silent. James and Percy felt very sorry for themselves. At last, Thomas spoke. You know, he said to no engine in particular, there's more than one way to get jammed. We all learned that today. Still, there was silence. What's more, we also learned that sometimes when engines help each other out of a jam, things can still go wrong. So, said a voice, so that means we learned a lot today, and therefore... Then came a chorus. We're really useful engines after all.
The likes of you and Oliver bumped the freight cars hard. You silly... Oliver and his brake van Toad liked working in the big yards, but one morning Toad noticed that Oliver was unhappy. He decided to find out why.
Excuse me, Mr. Oliver. It seems to me that things are not well with you. If you forgive me for mentioning it.
You're quite right, Toad. All I do is shunt these freight cars onto the turntable. I long for a nice run. It's what an engine really needs.
Quite so, Mr. Oliver. May I suggest that you speak to Sir Topham Hatt about your problems?
But Oliver said nothing. He just grew unhappier, and he was rough with the freight cars. You're no good, Oliver. You're dangerous. We want Percy. Percy's far too busy to be bothered with the likes of you. And Oliver bumped the freight cars hard. You silly engine, shouted a workman. It'll take a long time to repair this turntable, which will cause confusion and delay. That night, Sir Topham Hatt arrived. Oliver, you have caused confusion. I thought you could control freight cars. You shall work the mail train for a while. Maybe the night air will clear your smoke box. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir, said Oliver sadly. Cheer up, old chap, said his driver. The mail train run is a grand run for a fine engine like you. Oliver smiled, but he still felt he had let everyone down. His driver took them along the coastal run with the mail train. The fresh air couldn't help but brighten Oliver's spirits. They made good speed until it was time to collect some important mail from Harold the helicopter.
Come on, Harold!
At last, Harold landed. Sorry I'm late, Great Western. Had a bit of a problem with one of my arms. Kept letting me down when I was meant to be up. You know how it is. We know that we'll be late for our first run, replied Oliver's driver. Soon they were on their way again. Ahead was a red signal light. Oliver didn't realize that the signalman had dozed off. Oliver whistled several times, but the signal stayed red. There must be something wrong with that signal. We'll go slowly and stop by the signal box, said his driver. But they never reached it. The points before the signal box were switched to an old track. They were going the wrong way. Oliver's fireman was concerned. We need to find a water tower soon. Instead, they saw an old station. Disaster lay ahead. Meanwhile, Sir Topham Hatt was worried.
Oliver has not returned. We'll send out a search party.
Soon he was high in the sky with Harold.
There they are.
It wasn't Oliver's fault, sighed the driver.
I'm aware of that. I'm just glad to see you are all safe.
Then he saw something. It was an empty old house beside the station. He went to inspect it. When he returned, he spoke to Oliver.
You have found another attraction for our island. We'll make this house as good as new, and visitors can have tea and crumpets there.
Sighed Oliver. Getting lost can be interesting, but being found is much nicer. Especially when it makes an engine feel really useful.
But James bumped them so crossly that they were determined to get back at him. Presently, they approached the top of Gordon's Hill. Heavy freight trains. Toby and Henrietta were enjoying their new job on the island of Sodor, but they do look old-fashioned and did need new paint. James was very rude whenever he saw them. Yuck! What dirty objects, he would say. At last, Toby lost patience. James, he asked, why are you red? I am a splendid engine, answered James, ready for anything. You never see my paint dirty. Oh, said Toby innocently. That's why you once needed bootlaces, to be ready, I suppose. James went redder than ever and snorted off. It was such an insult to be reminded of the time a bootlace had been used to mend a hole in his coaches. At the end of the line, James left his coaches and got ready for his next train. It was a slow freight, stopping at every station to pick up and set down cars. James hated slow freight trains. Dirty cars from dirty siding. Yeah! Starting with only a few, he picked up more and more cars at each station till he had a long train. At first, the freight cars behaved well, but James bumped them so crossly that they were determined to get back at him. Presently, they approached the top of Gordon's Hill. Heavy freight trains halt here to set their brakes. James had had an accident with cars before and should have remembered this. "Wait, James, wait," said the driver, but James wouldn't wait. He was too busy thinking what he would say to Toby when they next met. The freight car's chance had come. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" they laughed, and banging their buffers, they pushed him down the hill. "On! On!" yelled the cars. "I've got to stop! I've got to stop!" groaned James. Disaster lay ahead. Something sticky splashed all over James. He had run into 2 tar wagons and was black from smokebox to cab. He was more dirty than hurt. But the tar wagons and some cars were all to pieces. Toby and Percy were sent to help and came as quickly as they could. "Look here, Percy," exclaimed Toby. "Whatever is that dirty object? That's James, didn't you know?" "It's James's shape," said Toby. "But James is a splendid red engine, and you never see his paint dirty." James pretended he hadn't heard. Toby and Percy cleared away the unhurt cars and helped James home. Sir Topham Hatt met them. "Well done, Percy and Toby." He turned to James. "Fancy letting your cars run away. I am surprised. You're not fit to be seen. You must be cleaned at once. Toby shall have a new coat of paint." "Please, sir, can Henrietta have one too?" said Toby. "Certainly, Toby." "Oh, thank you, sir. She will be pleased." All James could do was watch Toby as he ran off happily with the news.
Thomas passed through the next station, but he was almost out of puff. Thomas wasn't having fun anymore. It was a glorious day on the island of Sodor. Villagers, children, even Sir Topham Hatt was excited. The circus was coming. The engines were thrilled. They loved the circus too. Percy loved the horses. James loved the clowns. Children gathered on the bridges. They were waiting to see the circus pass by. Thomas became more and more excited. Everyone wanted to collect the circus from Brendam Docks. Sir Topham Hatt came to Tidmouth Sheds. He had exciting news for Thomas. Thomas, you are to collect the circus, he boomed. Thomas was very happy. Pulling the circus sounded like wonderful fun. But if there are too many freight cars for you to pull, added Sir Topham Hatt, you must share the work with another engine. Percy and James were pleased. Maybe they'd get to pull the circus after all. Thomas puffed over to Brendam Docks. Thomas steamed into the docks. Cranky was unloading the circus. Thomas was amazed. There were trailers and horse boxes, colorful costumes, coaches and flatbeds as far as the eye could see. Thomas was so excited his axles tingled. The acrobats and clowns climbed aboard Annie and Clarabelle. Thomas buffered up to collect the coaches. "Do you want a wheel there, matey?" asked Salty cheerfully. Thomas remembered what Sir Topham Hatt had said about sharing the work. But the band started playing, and everybody was cheering. Thomas thought this was the most wonderful special delivery ever. Even though the train was very heavy, he didn't want to share it. "No, thank you, Salty," he gasped. "I can do it on my own." And Thomas took the biggest puff he could and slowly pulled away. Thomas trundled through the countryside. His pistons pumped and his traction rods rattled. But Thomas didn't notice. He was having far too much fun. Thomas puffed toward Marin Station. He had a wonderful surprise. Passengers and staff waved and cheered as he passed by. The band played on, and Thomas blew his whistle in time with the trumpet. Thomas felt very special. Pulling the circus was lots of fun. Thomas stopped by a bridge. Percy was waiting there too. Children waved to Thomas and the circus. Thomas blew his whistle. Percy wanted to join in. "Is there anything I can take?" asked Percy hopefully. But Thomas wanted to keep all the fun to himself. "No, thank you," he gasped. "I can do it all on my own." Percy watched Thomas and the circus slowly chuff away. He felt very disappointed. Thomas puffed on. The train started to feel heavier and heavier. His traction rods were rattling more than ever. Thomas stopped at a junction. James was waiting in a siding. James thought the band sounded very jolly. "If you want to uncouple some freight cars," he said hopefully, "I could take them for you." "No, thank you," gasped Thomas. "I can do it all on my own." He didn't want to miss out on any of the fun. Thomas steamed on, but every huff and every chuff got harder and harder. Thomas passed through the next station, but he was almost out of puff. Thomas wasn't having fun anymore. Then there was trouble. With a horrible creak and a terrible crack, Thomas's traction rods broke. Thomas stopped with a jolt. Suddenly, it was very quiet. Thomas felt very sad. Thomas's driver telephoned for help. Even the performers practicing in the field didn't make Thomas feel better. Thomas wished he had shared the heavy load. Soon, Percy and James arrived. James brought new traction rods, and Percy brought hay for the horses. But Thomas still felt miserable. "I wish I'd shared the work with you," he said sadly. "Don't worry," puffed Percy. We can all have fun now, said James cheerfully. And he was right. While Thomas's traction rods were replaced, they all enjoyed watching the circus performers practice. Then Thomas shared the freight cars. Percy took the horses. James took the performers. Then the band started playing. This is fun, puffed Thomas. All three engines blew their whistles, and the long and jolly train set off. Later, the friends watched as the big tent was put up. Thank you for helping me, puffed Thomas. Sharing your work makes things much easier. But sharing the fun is the best fun of all. And everyone agreed.
That's it, puffed Thomas. I'll go to the party as a giant bubble. So Thomas puffed quickly away. Sticky Toffee Thomas. It was summertime on the island of Sodor. The engines were very busy. The children were having a big fancy dress party, and there were lots of jobs to do. Percy collected the cakes and buns. Toby collected some sticky toffee to make toffee apples. And Thomas took the tables and chairs. When Thomas delivered the tables and chairs, he saw some children. They were making fancy dress costumes. That looks fun, tooted Thomas. Then the Fat Controller spoke to Thomas.
I would like you to give train rides at the party,
the Fat Controller said.
But first, you must go to the washdown so you look your best.
Thomas was delighted. He loved giving the children train rides. Thomas puffed to the washdown. He was thinking about the children and their fancy dress costumes. I want to go to the party in fancy dress too, chuffed Thomas. Then I would really look my best. Thomas was soon covered in soapy suds. He was scrubbed and rubbed, rubbed and scrubbed. Then Percy arrived at the washdown.
You look like a giant bubble,
peeped Percy. That's it, puffed Thomas. I'll go to the party as a giant bubble. So Thomas puffed quickly away, still covered in bubbles. He couldn't wait to show the children his fancy dress. Then there was trouble. The bubbles blew into his eyes. Thomas couldn't see where he was going, and he bumped straight into the back of Toby. Toby's axle was broken. Sorry, puffed Thomas. Soon the Fat Controller arrived.
Toby, you must go to the yard to be repaired,
said the Fat Controller. If I don't take the sticky toffee to the party, the children won't be able to make toffee apples, moaned Toby. Please, sir, puffed Thomas. I could take the sticky toffee to the party.
Very well,
said the Fat Controller.
But no more trying to be in fancy dress.
Soon all the soapy bubbles were cleaned off Thomas, and he puffed away. I must get the sticky toffee to the children on time, Thomas puffed. But he started to think about fancy dress again. Thomas puffed up to the airport. And there, on the runway, was Jeremy the jet. "That's it," chuffed Thomas. "I would look grand if I arrived at the party as an aeroplane." Thomas watched Jeremy zoom up into the sky. He thought about his costume for the party. He thought about it for a very long time. "Oh no, I've been daydreaming," chuffed Thomas, "and now I'm late." Thomas puffed as fast as he could, but he wasn't watching where he was going. Thomas didn't notice that the points had been changed. Thomas puffed into the sidings and biffed into the buffers. Sticky toffee splattered everywhere. "Oh no," moaned Thomas. "I can't give the children train rides when I'm this messy. If only I'd been thinking about what I was doing." Then Thomas saw an old line. This gave him an idea. "A shortcut," puffed Thomas. "If I go that way, I can still get the toffee to the party on time." Thomas puffed along the old line. It hadn't been used for a very long time. Trees hung over the track, and the bushes were overgrown. But Thomas puffed carefully on. He knew he was late, so now he wasn't thinking about fancy dress. He was only thinking about getting to the party on time. Thomas bumped through the bushes and bashed through the branches, but he was still covered in sticky toffee. Leaves and twigs stuck to the sweet sticky goo. "Must get to the party, must get to the party," Thomas puffed. When Thomas arrived at the party, he was covered from funnel to footplate in leaves and twigs. Everyone cheered when they saw him. "I've brought you the toffee," Thomas puffed sadly, "but I'm too messy to give you train rides." The children cheered. "You're not messy, you're just in fancy dress. You look best of all." Thomas was very happy. The party was a great success, and there was only one thing more popular than the sticky toffee apples, and that was Sticky Toffee Thomas.
Sir, I'm sorry, sir.
When Henry arrived at the docks, Cranky the Crane looked down on him.
My, Henry, I expect you'll have some...
One day, Thomas was at the quayside of a small village. Fish were being loaded into his cars. The work took a long time. The fishermen were using old equipment, and Thomas was worried. "I'm going to be late for Henry at the docks. He won't like this. Please hurry up." Thomas was rudely interrupted. His driver and fireman laughed. "Phew," sniffed Thomas. "What a pong!" He was glad when they were speeding along the beautiful coastal run. Then they saw a man waving a red flag. "What's the matter now?" "High tides are damaging the track," reported the man. "I've marked the spot." "We'll go and inspect," said the driver. "It would be dangerous for heavy engines like Henry," agreed the driver. "But for Thomas, it's safe enough." The guard left a red oil lamp by the damaged track to warn engines. "When we get to the docks, I'll tell them to close the line." Henry was waiting for Thomas's cars.
Ha! You're late, and that smell is making me ill.
It's the fish, replied Thomas, and there's danger on the rails. That's why we're late.
Ha! You're the only danger on the rails, Thomas. Now stop wasting time and get your cars hitched to my train.
Thomas's driver and fireman were in the yardmaster's office when they heard Henry's whistle. He was steaming out of the station with his long, heavy train called the Flying Kipper. What route is Henry taking tonight? Asked the driver. The coastal run, it's the quickest. But I told you, gasped the driver. That's dangerous for a big engine like Henry. The yardmaster quickly phoned the signalman. Henry roared past the signal box.
I'll soon make up for lost time.
The signalman couldn't hear the warning. By the time he did, Henry was far away in a cloud of steam. But when Henry reached the coastal track, his hopes for a fast run were dashed. Fog floated everywhere.
I can't see,
cried Henry. Nor could his driver. And when he could, it was too late. As soon as the tide was high enough, Henry was craned out of the water.
Engines don't swim, Henry. You were meant to deliver fish, not swim with them. You should know that by now.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir.
When Henry arrived at the docks, Cranky the Crane looked down on him. My, Henry, I expect you'll have some fishy tales to tell. But take my advice, have a long hose down first. But there was worse to come. Look, they've caught all this fish and a green whale, too. It's not a whale, it's a monster. Henry was most upset. Thomas now felt sorry for Henry. Come on, your driver says it's time for a nice washdown. Then you'll feel much better. And Henry did.
I'm sorry I was rude to you, Thomas.
That's all right. But can you smell something?
What?
Fresh air.
Oh, yes,
replied Henry happily.
I promised, he panted. I promised. He made one more big effort, and at last... Every summer, the island of Sodor is very busy. Holidaymakers love to sightsee, and when the weather is fine, there is no better place to visit. Some people like to go to the mountains. Others like the valleys. Children love the seaside. One morning, Thomas was puffing along the line that runs by the coast. His two coaches, Annie and Clarabelle, were packed with children going to the beach. Everyone was happy. Percy was taking some freight cars to the harbor. Hello, Thomas. You look cheerful. I wish I could take children today instead of freight cars. They're the Vicar's Sunday School, explained Thomas. I'm busy this evening, but the station master says I can ask you to take the children home. Of course I will, promised Percy. Later, Percy saw Harold. Sorry, Percy. Can't talk. I'm on high alert. Why? Bad weather's due. My help's always needed. Mind how you go, Percy. Ha! Huffed Percy. As long as I've got rails to run on, I can go anywhere, in any weather, anyhow. Goodbye. Be careful, warned Edward. There's a storm coming. A promise is a promise, thought Percy, no matter what the weather. The children had a lovely day, but by tea time, dark clouds loomed ahead. Annie and Clarabelle were glad when Percy arrived. He was just in time. The rain streamed down Percy's boiler. Ugh! He shivered and thought of his nice dry shed. Percy struggled on past coastal villages and into the countryside. The river was rising fast. "I wish I could see! I wish I could see!" complained Percy as he battled against the rain. More trouble lay ahead. "Oh," hissed Percy, "the water is sloshing my fire!" Percy's driver and fireman had to find some more firewood. "I'll have some of your floorboards, please," said the fireman to the conductor. "I only swept the floor this morning," grumbled the conductor, but he still helped. Soon Percy's fire was burning well. He felt warm and comfortable again. Then he saw Harold. "Oh dear," thought Percy, "Harold's come to laugh at me." Something thudded onto Percy's boiler. "Ow!" exclaimed Percy. He needn't throw things. "It's a parachute," laughed his driver. "Harold's dropping hot drinks for us." "Thank you, Harold," whistled Percy.
Good to be of service.
Replied Harold and buzzed away. The water lapped Percy's wheels. Percy was losing steam again, but he plunged bravely on. "I promised," he panted. "I promised." He made one more big effort, and at last, exhausted but triumphant, he brought the train home. "Well done, Percy," cheered Thomas. "You kept your promise, despite everything." Sir Topham Hatt arrived in Harold. First he thanked the men, then Percy. "Harold told me you were a wizard. He said he can beat you at some things, but not at being a submarine. I don't know what you two get up to sometimes, but I do know that you're a really useful engine." "Oh, sir," whispered Percy happily.
Heave Ho Thomas. Thomas is a busy and happy engine. As he puffs and huffs across the island, he always toots hello to other engines and to children along the way, even when Thomas is pulling heavy loads. One morning, Thomas puffed into Brendam Docks. Sir Topham Hatt was waiting. "You are all here to welcome the new engine. His name is Hank." "I've heard he's very special. I've heard he's very strong." Hank puffed into the docks. Hank was very special. He had red wheels and a bright red cowcatcher, and he was very tall. The engines had never seen an engine like Hank before. Hank looks as strong as a giant. I'm sure he isn't stronger than a Sodor engine. "Now, Thomas, I have 3 jobs for you. First, you must take new machines from the docks to the factory. Then you are to pick up stone from the quarry and deliver it to the shunting yard. And lastly, you must pick up an old tractor from Farmer McCall's and take it to the repair yard." "Yes, sir." "And you must take Hank with you. Hank must see the important sights of Sodor. Be back by tea time for Hank's welcome party at Knapford." Thomas buffered up to the machine cars. Hank chuffed alongside. "Hello." "Howdy, Thomas. Now, you look like one of the finest little engines I've ever seen." Thomas didn't like being called little. "I'm a tank engine." Thomas thought Hank was being cheeky. "Those freight cars are way too heavy for you. Let me take them for you." Hank meant to be helpful, but it made Thomas cross. "No, thank you. I'm strong enough to pull much heavier loads than this. I'd be happy to help. But Thomas was already puffing out of the docks. At the signal, Thomas didn't take the track to the factory. He chuffed straight to the quarry. Thomas pulled ahead. I may not be grand, and I may not be long, but I will show Hank that I'm stronger than strong, he huffed to himself. Thomas and Hank puffed into the quarry. Now I'm going to pick up the stone cars. Hank was surprised. Hold your huffing there, Thomas. Let big old Hank take those cars for you. No, thank you. Tank engines can pull very heavy loads. So Thomas heaved and huffed out of the quarry. Thomas wheezed and wheeshed. Handsome Hank gleamed and glowed by his side. Children waved from bridges. Hello, Thomas. Howdy, good to see ya. Hey, Thomas, aren't you gonna whistle hello? Thomas hadn't the puff to whistle hello. Hank had plenty of puff. This made Thomas even crosser. Thomas pulled up to the hole. He was nearly out of puff. Hello, Farmer McCall. This is Hank. He's the new engine on Sodor. Howdy, Farmer McCall. That's a mighty fine tractor you have. Say, Thomas, you look all out of puff and pull. I'll take it for you. No, thank you. And the tractor was coupled up to the end of Thomas's freight cars. Thomas huffed and he puffed, and his wheels spun and spun. Come on, Thomas, the train's too heavy for you. Take the pressure off your pistons. Couple me up. But Thomas was determined to pull the train on his own. We must not be late for your party. Wheel turn by wheel turn, Thomas puffed away. Thomas and Hank arrived at Marin Station. Visitors waved at Thomas. Thomas wanted to whistle back, but he hadn't any spare steam. Howdy, everybody. Thomas is a little overloaded right now. I'll whistle for him. Hank had lots of steam, and Hank blew the longest and loudest whistle. Then there was trouble. Thomas had cracked the cylinder. The train was much too heavy. Oh, no. Now the deliveries won't be made. You won't be back in time for your welcome party. And I'm not a really useful engine, or even a really strong one. Shucks, Thomas. I'm so sorry. That's too bad. I wanted to show you that I wasn't just a fine little steam engine. I wanted to show you that I am really strong. So I didn't want to ask for your help. But I do now. Please, Hank. I'd be happy to help. You give the orders, I'll do the pushing. Hank and Thomas dropped off Farmer McCall's tractor. The workmen were very sorry to see Thomas had broken down. Next, Hank and Thomas chuffed into the shunting yards. The yard manager was waiting. The stone cars were uncoupled. I hope you're back on track really soon, Thomas. Finally, Thomas and Hank delivered the new machines to the factory. Thank you, Thomas. Hank pushed Thomas back to Knapford Station. They arrived just in time for the party. Thank you, Hank. Now all of Sodor knows what a strong engine you are. Hank smiled. And I know something, too. You're the engine everyone cheers for on Sodor. That's something to be proud of. Thomas smiled. Hank was very special. He was a very special new friend.